Tonight, glad we could all be together. Such a lovely, balmy night out. But thankful that we are in here where it's warm and dry. So it's good to be with you. Before we get into our study, Doug, may I call on you to lead us in a word of prayer?
Absolutely. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you for this day and this chance to be here together tonight to learn more about your word and your church and different churches. And pray that you would be with all the leaders tonight, help them to recall all that they have prepared. Pray you'd help us to block out the cares of the world. We ask that you'd be with those that may not be able to be with us tonight, that may be sick or recovering. Pray you continue to heal them, Lord, and keep us all safe and in good health. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Let me start off just asking, does anybody have a burning question that pertains to things we've been going over lately? And just take a moment and see if anybody here knows the answer to it. Okay. Let me start off then with a question. And so I'm using the word denomination here in this lesson. So what does that word mean? That's one way to define it, like denominations of currency. Yeah. That's it. Yeah, that's really the meaning of the term. So it's placing a name on something that distinguishes it from other things. So it's just another way of getting at the idea. It is about distinctions, divisions, but it all started with different names that have been applied to these different divisions of Protestantism. And there's really no such term or concept until at least the 16th century, and we really see this kind of crystallizing here at the beginning of the 17th century, beginning of the 1600s, and so we're going to start off kind of talking about that a little bit, and just go through and identify some. Briefly, that tell the story of some of the familiar churches, denominational churches, and how they came into being, and then we'll shift gears and we're going to talk about some efforts to bring about renewal or revival that have occurred during this period. So, start off just kind of refreshing our minds here with what we've been doing in our timeline. And as we have thought about the idea of apostasy, that is departures from the original church, departures from the original plan for the church, that's sometimes called apostasy. And so the perspective here that I'm presenting is that the Roman Catholic Church came into existence as a result of that, as a result of a very slow, very gradual, little by little steps over a very long period of time. And so then what we have begun looking at is the Protestant Reformation came about as, in part, as a result of efforts to try to correct abuses in the church and try to recover what has been lost and try to get back to the original design for the church. We've already seen that there were varying degrees of how far people were willing to go in the reform efforts. And one of the things that we've talked about is that there were some who viewed the work, the reform work, as more of a restitution or trying to reconstitute or to restore the original church. So, we can use these terms, Reformation versus Restoration. And a lot of times it comes down to the difference between those who are only willing to go so far with the reform and those who are willing to go further with the reform. So when we talked about the Anabaptists on Sunday, I think we see there a good example of people who were committed to go much further, who really felt, in fact, that the reformers hadn't really gone far enough, that they had abandoned their own principles of adhering to the Bible only and only doing those things that the Bible authorized, and they felt that they had not lived up to that, and so they were trying to be have a more thorough kind of reformation. So we can use these different terms. Now I've mentioned this before I forget. Kathy and I, Lord willing, we're going to be gone next week. We'll be gone Sunday and Wednesday, and my brother Robert is going to be taking the class, and I've dumped all kinds of information and reading on him over the past month, and some of my PowerPoints and stuff like that. He'll probably scrap all of that and do his own thing, which is fine, but I've tried to help him out. I know he can do it. So what he's going to be discussing with you Sunday and Wednesday is the Restoration Movement, as it's called. And so what we want to talk about tonight is kind of some background information, some information that helps us to get from the Reformation period down to around 1800, when a lot of these things begin to occur. And a lot of this is designed to help us understand a lot of the forces and the factors that were behind that, why things had built up to the point where not only there were those who saw the need for this, but there was a climate and an environment in which it was conducive to that. So all that together, that's a feeble way of trying to describe it, but that's kind of the idea. All right, so on that last one there, what came out of the Reformation movement is this denominationalism, and that's how I started. The first question is, we're talking about that and seeing more about how all that came about. So by the end of the 1500s, certainly religious division was a reality. This had occurred, but we begin to see with the formation of confessional creeds and systematic theologies and things like that that are developed, that the lines of separation become hardened. They become more distinct. And so we've talked about some of these things. The Lutherans in 1530 came up with the Augsburg Confession. The Augsburg Confession was their statement of belief that was presented there fairly early in the Reformation period, and with very, very little revision, it is still the official statement of the Lutheran Church today. The Anglicans came up ultimately with 39 articles, and as we talked about before, when Queen Elizabeth I took the throne, they had been through a lot of back and forth. Of course, Henry VIII was the one who separated the Church of England from Rome and established what became known as the Anglican Church, or the Church of England. When Edward came to the throne, it was a shift toward more radical Protestantism for about 5.5 years. When he died and Mary came to the throne, the pendulum swung all the way to the other extreme. And so there were people behind her. She was, of course, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon that Henry divorced. And so she wanted to bring back Catholicism. And so there was that move to do that. Well, when she died, then after 5 years on the throne, Elizabeth takes the throne. People were sick and tired of all these extremes, for one thing. And it was a very shaky situation politically. How is she going to be able to hold this kingdom together? with all of these factions, all these interests, and all of these passionate, strong religious convictions that were at opposite ends of the spectrum. That's a pretty foreboding kind of situation. And so what she ended up doing was sometimes called the Elizabethan settlement, which was a very broad latitude. One way it could be put is that, as you know, it satisfied almost everybody except the most devout Catholics that were around on the one extreme, and the most extreme nonconformist Protestants on the other extreme. If you went to church at least twice a year, you know, on Christmas and Easter, and if you paid your tithes to the church and you behaved yourself and so forth, they would leave you alone. So the act of uniformity was very broad and left room for a lot of differences. All right, so we'll come back to that in a minute. We also see, of course, then this third major branch of the Protestant Reformation was called the Reformed. And so Reformed and Presbyterians, these are the Calvinists, and there are actually a number of, they were in various countries, of course, and where different languages were spoken. And so you have the Scottish Presbyterian Church that finally came into being through the work of John Knox. They had the Scottish Confession of Faith. By 1647, they ended up adopting that third one, their Westminster Confession of Faith, because this was the one that really became widely accepted in the English-speaking world. Dutch Reform, they had their own, and so forth. So what my point is, there were many others we could list here, but what does this do? What does this do when these religious bodies now come up with these official statements of faith? Does that serve to bring about more unity, or does it serve to harden the lines of separation? Yeah, it just divides, and that's the point, that the big picture point that I want us to take away from this is that this is what's happening here, and this is the period of time where we really begin to hear them talking about denominations. They begin to acknowledge the fact there's no going back. You know, for a long time during the early time of the Reformation, there was always hope in these people's minds that they could bring about reform but not divide the church. That's pretty well passed by this time. Any questions about this? I don't want to. I want to move on because I've got a lot to cover. I want to say something about these religious wars. Almost from the beginning of the Reformation period, in the 1500s, we start seeing all these wars, and you know it's kind of hard for us to understand that. But if we see how complex this was and how everything was connected, and so you have these wars were being fought. Yes, they were fought over religious differences, but there were also the political concerns, and it's very hard to separate them. I mean, they were so interconnected. There were all these political rivalries. There were all these concerns about the territories that were going to be controlled, and a lot of it was just the fact that we wonder how could people go to war over religion? How could they put people to death because they taught something that was different from the official belief? Why would they do that? And it's hard for us to give an answer, but I tell you, we don't want to overlook the simple fact is that's how seriously they took religion. That's part of it. But it wasn't just that. It was all of the politics that went into it. And you know, when the Reformation came, it not only divided people religiously, it divided Europe politically. Europe would never be united again the way it once had been. And that was part of the fallout of it. And it was partly because of these things we've mentioned here. So you have a number of things happen real quickly here that brings all this to an end. In Germany, after Luther's death, there was warfare. You have Some of the princes in Germany were Catholic, some of the princes were Protestant. So they formed these two different leagues, confederations, and they have several years of war. Well, finally they have a peace that's made in 1555, where basically they agree that whatever the belief or the faith or the religion of the prince of a particular principality is, that's what the official religion will be in that territory. Now, they did have one reservation in that was going to come back later to haunt them. The balance of power was really shifted in favor of the Catholics in Germany, because they said if a Catholic prince, if a Protestant prince converts to Catholicism, then he takes that territory with him and it becomes a Catholic territory. But if a Catholic prince changes his religion and becomes Protestant, the territory remains Catholic. Well, after enough decades passed, yeah, there were some people changing their religion, or some prince would die and his successor would be of the opposite persuasion. So what happens over a period of time? There's a shift in the balance of power, and the Catholics gained a lot of territory. I'll come back to that in a minute. So what that means is the fighting is not over in Germany. In France, there were the Huguenots, sometimes those of us from the South will say. There was a pretty good chunk of them in France. France was a Catholic nation; they were officially Catholic, but the Huguenots, they were Calvinist Protestants, especially in the southwestern part of the country, and they were a very wealthy and influential group. So it was almost like a state within the state. Well, it all kind of broke out in about 1559. There were some really extreme soldiers some of the pro-Catholic people that saw a bunch of Huguenots in a barn worshiping, and they went and killed them all. Just slaughtered them. Well, that started war, and so the warfare went for decades in France. And you have all these factions there. You have the Huguenots, you have the pro-Catholic, you have the ones in between. They're just trying to hold things together, the monarchy. And before it was over, Henry of Navarre, he was the leader of the Huguenots all this time, and he kind of emerges as the leader. And anybody know what he did in order to accept the throne and become Henry IV of France and bring peace to this situation? He said, you know, the throne is worth a mass. Something to that effect. He changed his religion from being the leader of the Protestants, and he agreed to become a Catholic so that he could become the king and bring an end to the war. So which was it? Was it a more religious war or a political war? You decide. Where I'd mentioned that, you know, the Netherlands ended up being divided. They had a revolt against the King of Spain, who was controlling the Netherlands. They didn't like it. They didn't like a foreign king telling them what to do, so they revolted, and a lot of them were Protestants. But it was split, and this was one of those countries where there were all these different provinces, about 17 of them. Well, the ones in the south, what ended up happening is they pull away and become the beginnings of the modern nation of Belgium, and they remain Catholic. The 7 northern provinces became the Netherlands. So the modern nation of Netherlands emerged at that point as a result of that revolt. And so you see modern Europe is taking shape here. But it's also religious divisions behind it. But the big war, though, was the 30 Years' War in Germany. So remember that those princes that converted to from Catholic to Protestant, they had to, their land remained Catholic. So they've gained all this territory. The balance of power has gotten out of balance, and so war breaks out. And this was one of the most devastating wars in the history of Europe. I mean, it went on for 30 years. Of course it was. And this is one of those ironies. The thing that finally brought it to an end is when France and really one of the real leaders of the king, behind the king, was Cardinal Richelieu in France. And they came into the war and were able to bring an end to it. They came into the war on the side of the Protestants. At least the forces that started out fighting for the Protestants, they come in on the side of the Protestants. Figure that out. So was it more religion or was it more politics? I'm just, part of that's just to tell you how confusing this is, to try to figure it out. It's hard to understand for us. There were all of these factors involved, but the Peace of Westphalia finally kind of brought an end to this period of warfare. France became the dominant power of Europe. Holland and Switzerland were recognized as Protestant states, and so forth. You have Lutheranism in parts of Germany and Scandinavia. You have the Reformed faith in Switzerland and the Netherlands and parts of France. You have Anglicanism in England. You have Presbyterianism in Scotland. You have the Anabaptists scattered throughout Europe, but especially in the Netherlands. And of course, you have Catholicism dominant in Spain and France and parts of Germany. Did you get that? But the other thing that came out of it, out of the Peace of Westphalia, is we finally enter into a period of general religious toleration. They finally had come to the point where even in these countries where so much fighting had taken place and where they had their official religion for their country, they come to recognize that there has to be toleration for the people who are dissenters within our country. They're part of our country. We have to find a way. So they still had a state religion, but they allow more freedom for people to express their own religious faith. Now, all that again is to say, this is, what does this kind of situation of warfare do to people's faith? Let's just get back to the principle of faith. What does it do to people's faith? What do you think? Makes them cynical. It's hard to go through war, to see all of the bloodshed and all of the suffering, and it causes people to wonder: is this really the truth? Is this really what faith in God is all about? Is this really what Christianity is all about? And so it had a very powerful and destructive effect upon a lot of the churches. Now they've gotten through all of this. What do they do now? And a lot of things, made that even worse. Is a lot of these churches kind of settle into what has been called Protestant scholasticism, where it becomes very intellectual and philosophical, and it's all about having all the right knowledge and everything, but very little emphasis on piety and spirituality and a relationship with God. At least that's the way a lot of people came to feel about it. So I want you to keep that in mind as we go. But now I want to talk about the Puritans for a minute. England, experienced its own form of religious pluralism. And why this is so important for us is we begin to get a picture of what was going to happen when these American colonies were established. Because a lot of the groups that came over originally were people seeking religious freedom. They had other economic interests, of course, in a lot of these ventures, but they certainly were bringing their religions with them. So what do we have there? Well, the Puritans were not one church or religious group. They consisted of various nonconformist groups. They all wanted to purify the church. They all felt that the Church of England still had too much leftover vestiges of Roman Catholicism in the worship, in their doctrine, and all of these things. Aside from all the differences that I'll summarize in a moment, the one thing that was kind of a constant among all the Puritans was a steadfast commitment to following the Scriptures as the only religious standard. Make sure you heard what I said. That's I think, one of the great legacies of the Puritan movement, is that these were people who held to the principle the Bible should be our only standard. Now they didn't always agree, and so obviously they didn't always get it right. But they held to that. They held to that principle, and I think we owe a great deal to that. And so you have all these groups there. We have, of course, there were Roman Catholics. There were the High Church Anglicans. These are the ones that the Anglican Church came to the point where they looked very much like Roman Catholicism, with all of the nature of the worship, the high ceremonies and so forth. There were, of course, Quakers eventually. John Fox started the Quakers. I had a little bit about that in the chapter. And there were other groups. There was a whole array of them. But the Puritans, the ones that are called Puritans, basically, there were moderate Anglicans. There were the low church Anglicans that were more Protestant in their thinking. And they had come, most of these groups had come to embrace Calvinism to some degree. You have the Presbyterians. The Presbyterians believed in a Presbyterian form of church government, rather than it being a top-down where all the authority resides in the bishop, and the bishop, of course, is close friends with the monarchy. They wanted elders that are appointed by the local congregation. Congregationalists believed that too, but they believed in independent congregations. They took it a step further. They didn't believe that the congregations ought to be centralized under a synod or something like that. The separatists, what did they believe? What distinguished them from the others? Well, they believed in separation of church and state. They were also Congregationalists in their concept of the church, autonomy, local church, but they believed there shouldn't be any connection at all with the monarchy, with the government. They shouldn't have anything to do with making decisions about the church. And then there were the Baptists. And so where did they come from? Well, they came out of the separatists. So, on the previous chart, you see there the separatists. Well, what happened was a man by the name of John Smythe and a group of these separatists go over to Holland, to the Netherlands, and they spend several years there, starting in about 1607, and Thomas Hell was with him. And through their study of the Scriptures, along with their having met up with some Mennonites, that is Anabaptists, and they were influenced by them, they interacted with them, they learned from them, they come to the conviction that the Anabaptists are right about believers' baptism. They come to reject infant baptism. Baptism is for believers, for adults. They embrace the idea that the local church organization should be congregational and independent, autonomous churches, and that the Lord's Supper is a memorial. They embrace all of these things. And so eventually, Smith ends up apparently joining the Mennonites. He stays over there. But Helwys comes back to England in 1611, establishes the first Baptist church. That's where it started officially, when he establishes a Baptist congregation in England. Now I have there general versus particular. Anybody know what that refers to? This is a test. What's general versus particular? All right, so this Baptist church was a general Baptist church, which means they believed in a universal atonement, that the atonement of Jesus was universal. Jesus died for everybody. So was that Calvinistic or non-Calvinistic? That's non-Calvinistic. And so this first congregation, and a lot of the Baptists were general Baptists. But as time went by, a lot of the Baptist churches were known as particular Baptists, because they believed in a particular atonement, that the atonement of Jesus was only for the elect. Remember TULIP, limited atonement? And so that's kind of been the history of the Baptist church, even to the present day. Don't assume that your friend who is a Baptist, don't assume that they're a Calvinist in their thinking. They may not be Calvinist at all. Or they may only accept certain aspects of Calvinist doctrine. Don't assume that they accept all of it, even just because they accept part of it. Because the Baptists, they don't have much centralized organization, never have. They're more autonomous, like we are. Now they have conventions like the Southern Baptist Convention and other things that have centralized things to some degree, but those have never had the authority like other denominations have had, to dictate what local churches and the Christians in the local churches are to believe. And so you have a lot of diversity there. Questions or comments about that? That's the Baptist church. Well, most of the time it was congregational, but I don't think I'm wrong in saying that just the nature of the Baptist church has always been that individuals will often hold different views within a congregation. It's going to depend on the congregation. Some of them are going to have an iron fist and say, this is the way you got to believe if you're going to be here. But, human nature is human nature. And so it's hard to predict those things. Now, let's talk about some of these efforts toward revival. There are lots of reasons for this. Of course, all the wars that we talked about left people cynical and disillusioned. At the beginning of the 1700s, England was experiencing a movement known as deism. It was kind of the beginnings of what historians refer to as the Great Enlightenment of the 18th century. Emphasis on rationalism that spread throughout Europe. That meant that in a lot of cases it was an attitude of skepticism toward the Bible and toward belief in God. I mean, the most extreme manifestation of it is what happened in the French Revolution, which was a totally atheistic revolution. That all was part of the Enlightenment. Well, it's just getting started in the early 1700s, and it infiltrated a lot of the churches, and there were a lot of complaints about a lack of zeal, lack of fervency. People were going through the motions. There was not much spiritual fervor. So, first of all, just say something about in Germany. This man, Philip Spener, he starts calling for reform in the churches, in German Lutheran churches, and in morals and practical life, in education. And he instituted the practice of having these meeting in little small groups or classes, and people would get together and they would study the Bible, they would pray, they would try to edify one another and think of things to do that would be of service to their fellow man and help each other to grow. He wrote a book, which has become a very famous book, called Pia Desideria, Southern pronunciation, which basically is Latin for we desire this piety, we desire piety, we desire holiness, and it was kind of like his plan for bringing a lot of that about. He talked about the spiritual decline that was being observed, and had all these proposals, things like we need to get back to just using the Bible. That's a novel idea. We need to put emphasis on the Bible and nothing else. We need to renew the concept of the priesthood of all believers. We need to emphasize putting our faith into practice as opposed to just intellectual knowledge and what we know and what we believe. We need to put it into practice in practical ways. Even when we have religious controversy, we need to do it honorably and conduct ourselves as Christians. It was a movement then that took off, and it spread throughout a lot of the churches. And so several decades later, a descendant of Spener was this man Zinzendorf. I always like to say that name, even with a southern pronunciation. Ludwig von Zinzendorf. Sounds like somebody from a movie or something. But he worked among the Moravians. You mentioned the Moravians Sunday. Yeah. Well, the Moravians, as I said, they were kind of, they go all the way back to the time of John Huss. This man in Bohemia, modern-day Czech Republic, who was burned at the stake for a lot of these views, long before Martin Luther. Well, they're still around, and so he goes there into Bohemia, into Moravia, and engages in this same kind of effort to try to bring about spiritual revival. And Moravians became very well known for their emphasis on personal spirituality and holiness and trying to live it out in their lives. Well, that has something to do with the more well-known movement to us, and that's the Wesleyan movement. Because it was also, in part, in England, a reaction to this rationalistic religion of deism. And the Church of England was just kind of dead in many ways. So Wesley, he goes to Oxford, and he is a student there, and he eventually comes back and teaches there. And his brother Charles was a student there, and also at the same time George Whitefield was a student there. And they and some other students started a campus club. They called it the Holy Club. And the idea of this Holy Club was to emphasize Bible study and prayer and doing good deeds. They had a methodical way of doing this, and so they got the nickname Methodists. That's kind of where that started. They were serious about it and say, we need to have a plan for spiritual growth, and they started right there on that campus, and it spread. Well, so that was kind of where some of this started. Well, Wesley comes in contact with George Whitefield. Now, George Whitefield, he had started the practice of preaching outdoors. He had this field preaching, and he was somebody got there. He just preached extemporaneously, and he was a small guy with a booming voice, and he could move these people. And he was flamboyant. He was emotional, and he could get under their skin, you know. And so he's doing that, and he influences Wesley. You need to do this too. You need to get out of the church buildings, go out here into the fields. People are hungering and thirsting to hear the gospel. That was kind of the attitude toward it. So that was an influence on Wesley. In fact, the two of them end up coming over here. Wesley, in fact, is sent over here to Savannah, Georgia. And he spends just a couple of years in Savannah, Georgia. And about 1738, and as he is on his way home, he's on a ship, and the ship was the voyage was pretty rough, a lot of storms, and people got scared. He met some Moravians on that ship, and his report later was how impressed he was with their faith and their calmness in all this, and how godly they seemed to be. Well, he gets home, and he has this famous supposed conversion experience where he's listening to someone read some things that Martin Luther had written on Romans, and it says he felt his heart strangely warmed. He had a conversion experience. That's the way he put it, you know. And not long after that, he goes and meets with some Moravians. So that had a big impact on him. So the bottom line of all of this is that he starts a movement. He never intended for it to be another denomination or another church. His brother helped him a lot too. His brother is more famous for the hymns that he wrote. He wrote over 7,000 hymns, and there you look at that list, and we know a whole lot of those and still sing them, don't we? He was a fabulous hymn writer. John Wesley himself, during his life, and he was doing this up until he was in his 80s and 90s, he would travel on horseback from village to village, hamlet to hamlet, and preach outside to people who would listen. He traveled over 200,000 miles, it's estimated, mostly on horseback, and preached some 42,000 sermons. And a lot of that along with Whitefield. Now, the two of them kind of had a parting of the ways. They kind of agreed to disagree because Whitefield was a pretty strong Calvinist and Wesley wasn't. Wesley rejected a lot of the Calvinistic principles, which tells us something about the Methodist Church. He was a great organizer. They had these little classes and societies, set up circuits. You never heard of circuit riders? Especially over here in the colonies. Francis Asbury was sent over here to help the fledgling Methodists in this country, and he traveled all over the place on horseback, circuit riders, going from place to place, encouraging people. Well, that's the Methodist Church, the Church of the Nazarene, Assemblies of God. So many religious groups are influenced some way by the Wesleyan movement. Questions before I get to the last home stretch here? So in the colonies, when they start coming over here, that kind of gives you an idea of the geographical distribution at the beginning. Of course, it didn't remain that way. But at the bottom, I put when the Methodists came over in the mid-1700s, 100 years after the rest of them came, they were kind of all over the place in most of the colonies. I'm going to skip over and not say more about that one. Now let's talk about the Great Awakening. George Whitefield was involved in that too. In fact, he was kind of kicked it off over. He came over here to the colonies in about 1740, and this thing started. And before it was over, I mean, it was spreading from church to church, and it was a sort of a general revival. Yeah, I mean, it wasn't a formal, organized revival. It was very spontaneous in many ways, but it sort of spread. And it resulted in a good bit of increase in church membership. Whitefield was quite effective at that kind of work. And that was throughout, especially the New England colonies and the middle colonies over here. When the American Revolution came, again, what does war do? It's not good. It's not good for morals. It's not good for faith. Many times the pressures of the revolution itself, because it divided churches. Which side am I going to be on? Of course, if you're in the Anglican Church, that was pretty well, you knew what you were going to do. But others, it caused problems. But at the end of it, of course, separation of church and state, free exercise of religion, became part of the Constitution here. And you see that a number of national organizations are formed. So the Methodist Episcopal Church, that became the Methodists, they were officially organized in America. The Protestant Episcopal Church, that was the Anglican Church. That's the American version. Eventually, it just simply became known as the Episcopal Church, and the others followed as well, because they want to have a presence. They do have a presence here, but now they're cutting the ties with the mother country. We need to have our own organization over here. So that begins. Does that further cause the hardening of the lines, the denominational separations? Of course it does. Even over here where there's so much religious freedom. So that brings us then finally to near the end of the 1700s, the Second Great Awakening, and it was far greater, and the impact of it was far greater than the first one. They've been through a war. There was all kinds of internal dissent. There was a lot of indifference toward religion. I mean, there was just worldliness. This one writer I brought along a little quote. He writes about, "We are fast becoming a nation of drunkards. We could ascertain that there are 300,000 drunkards in our land, and that from 10 to 20,000 were annually assigned to drunkards' graves. Piety seems to be flying out of our land. Religion declined, morality extinguished, vice grew bold, profaneness reveling. Dishonesty and sinful amusements greatly increased. Universalism, infidelity, atheism, scoffing at all serious godliness, contempt for the holy Sabbath, etc., etc., etc." I don't have time to read the rest of it. That's not a very pretty picture. It's moral depravity, it's intellectual, it's worldliness, secularism, it's indifference toward religion. And along with that, a lot of division in the churches. And so this movement started in some of the colleges at first. At Yale, this Timothy Dwight, he starts making chapel talks and sermons exhorting the students about all this that's going on. And things got started there and spread to other places. But where it really took off was on the frontier. these camp meetings. This James McGreedy that would go to these places like Logan County, Kentucky. The biggest one, the famous one's Cane Ridge. And when my brother teaches class Sunday, you're going to probably talk some more about Cane Ridge. But there was phenomenal growth. The Methodists grew more than anybody else as a result of the Second Great Awakening. The Baptists not far behind them. Presbyterians were mixed because of the nature of who they were. But perhaps the greatest thing was that it created an atmosphere conducive to the beginning of the Restoration movement. People were they were looking for unity. They were looking for something meaningful, and what you'll see is that there were people from various denominations in various parts of the country at the same time began calling for, let's just get back to the Bible. Let's just look at the Bible and take only the Bible and see if that can bring unity. But above all, it will bring a restoration of New Testament Christianity. Yeah. Yeah, especially Scotland. It was a mixed bag during this time, and some exciting things are going to happen. You'll see about that in these next two. I'll send those out to you tomorrow for you to read, and my brother's going to take the class and lead you in some discussions. I appreciate him doing that too. Thank y'all.
Number 780 we'll sing after Les brings us an invitation. Number 780. Well, I'm still at 780 is the invitation. 422 we'll sing right now. 422. Majestic Sweetness. It's good to see you. We have several visitors with us. It's good to see you. We're going to omit the second verse. Sing 1, 3, 4, 5. Majestic sweetness sits enthroned upon the Savior's brow. His head with praise
Well, I'm going to be talking to the people who are non-Christians again tonight, primarily. The lesson starts with Paul and Silas teaching in the Roman colony of Philippi. They're, of course, in their teaching, they teaching Jesus, so they're teaching that he is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And they'd gone to their place of prayer, and a young woman, young girl, slave girl, meets up with them. Now, she had a spirit in her that where she could tell the future. And the men that owned her were making a good bit of money off of her. So she meets up with Paul and Silas, and she says, "These men are bondservants of the Most High God, who are proclaiming to you the way of salvation." Now, she follows them around, and she keeps saying this information, this proclamation. Well, can you imagine if Paul and Silas are teaching people, and then she comes up and says this? It kind of breaks the concentration. And Paul gets annoyed with it. Annoyed with it to the extent that he says, he turned and said to the Spirit, "I command you in the name of Jesus Christ to come out of her." And it came out immediately. Well, that took care of one of the problems that they were having, but they soon had another. The owners of the girl got very perturbed at them because they no longer could make the money they were making because she no longer had the spirit. So they grabbed Paul and Silas, took them before the magistrate, and they said, they told the magistrate, says, "These men are throwing our city into confusion, being Jews, and are proclaiming customs for which are not lawful for us to accept, to observe, being Romans." Well, you stop and think about it. The Roman emperors thought they were gods. They liked to be worshipped. And of course, Paul and Silas' allegiance was to Jesus. He was Lord of Lords and King of Kings. So this is what they were talking about. The Romans, they were preaching and not giving the allegiance the Romans liked. So the crowd rose up together against them. The chief magistrates tore their robes off and proceeded to order them to be beaten. Many blows. And then they commanded the jailer to guard them securely. So he put them in the inner prison and put their feet into stocks. Well, there they sat. They couldn't move. And but they could do what they normally did. They could talk about Jesus, they could pray, they could sing, and that's what they did. Now, all of the people that were in prison there heard them. They did this, and they could understand exactly what they were saying. And no doubt the jailer knew what they were saying too, because he was listening. Had to be. So, along about midnight, an earthquake happened, and the prison doors were all swung open, the chains were broken, the leg stocks were separated from Paul and Silas, and they could again stand. And the jailer, seeing this, drew his sword. Now, let's think about that. First of all, I don't doubt that the jailer was a soldier, a Roman soldier, charged with the responsibility of keeping prisoners. Now, I don't know what the sentence would be for him if he lost his prisoners, but I think he figured that death by sword would be a lot quieter and a lot better than what he'd have to go through. So, let's consider this for a minute. Let's say that he did kill himself. Where would he be in judgment? He had heard some stuff about Jesus from the Paul and Silas being in jail, but he was not in the Lamb's Book of Life. So what would happen? He'd be lost. And being lost, he ended up in hell. Fortunately, that's not what happened. Paul cried out and says in a loud voice, "Do not harm yourself, for we are all here." And he called for the lights and rushed in. Can't you just imagine him lighting a torch and going and checking and seeing what's happening? Paul said they were all here, so I imagine he got to the first jail cell door being open. Don't you think he closed it and went on through? But when he got to Paul and Silas, he fell down before them. He brought them out and he says, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" That tells me he was listening. He knew what was going on. He had been listening to Paul and Silas, and he knew to ask them what he could do to be saved. They said, "Believe in the Lord Jesus Christ, and you'll be saved, you and your household." It says they spoke the word of the Lord to him, together with all who were in the house. I wonder how long that took. But he said, and he took them that very hour of the night and washed their wounds, and immediately he was baptized, he and all his household. They were added to the Lamb's Book of Life. Now just think about that. It couldn't have been a couple of hours maybe. How much time have you spent in classes listening to the teachings of Christ? I tell you, it's significant. A long, you can't fathom the difference between what you've had and what they had. But they had enough to know what to do. And he brought them into the house and set food before them. Well, he says immediately he was baptized. Then they brought him into the house and set food before them and rejoiced greatly, having believed in God with all his household. He also previously it said they washed their wounds. I tell you, that couldn't have taken more than a day or an afternoon. But they're added to the Lamb's Book of Life. To all those who are not Christians tonight, you know about Jesus. You studied Jesus. You know exactly. You know 1,000 times more than what they knew. If you died tonight, where would you be? Would you be lost? You can record your name in the Lamb's Book of Life tonight. We're going to sing an invitation song soon, like we did last time. At the conclusion, I'm going to ask the congregation to sit down. If you want to become a child of God tonight, remain standing. But before you do, I want you to consider this. James 4:13 through 17. Come now, you who say tomorrow, or today or tomorrow, we will go in such city and spend a year there and engage in business and make a profit. Yet you do not know what your life will be like tomorrow. You are just a vapor and appear for a little while and then vanish away. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and also do this or that. But as it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. Therefore, to one who knows the right thing to do and does not do it, to him it is sin. What happens to sinners? They're lost. So the question is, are you going to be lost tonight or are you going to be saved tonight? Do you believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God? Look, we have water. What hinders you from being baptized tonight? Let us be standing as we sing.
And with the Savior we enter the glory land, won't it be wonderful there? And in the troubles and cares of the storyland, won't it be wonderful there? Won't it be wonderful there? Having no burdens to bear, joyously singing with heart bells all ringing, oh, won't it be wonderful there? Walking and talking with Christ the supernal one, won't it be wonderful there? Praising, adoring the matchless eternal one, won't it be wonderful there? Won't it be wonderful there? Having no burdens to bear over there, joyously singing with heart bells all ringing, oh, won't it be wonderful there? presence will never be sweeping us. Won't it be wonderful there? Sure that forever the Lord will be keeping us. Won't it be wonderful there? Won't it be wonderful there? Having no burdens to bear, joyously singing with heart bells all ringing. Oh, won't it be wonderful, wonderful there?
She made that choice. Do you believe that Jesus is the Son of God? Wish. It's wonderful. You believe Jesus is the Son of God? I do. Bless you. Do you believe Jesus is the Son of God?
Yes, sir.
Bless you. We're going to baptize you tonight. Go ahead and have you got